Hello everyone, welcome. It is Michael here with Offshore Citizen, and we are here in my apartment in Bulgaria. So we're going to talk today, we're going to do a few videos, and this first one we're going to talk about the subject of why Delaware. So you might have seen a lot of talk about kind of Delaware, Nevada, Wyoming, these states in the US being tax havens possibly. And also about why specifically those. So one of the most common questions that I get from people who are looking at setting up something in the US is where to set up, right? And there's a few common places that you'll hear about. You'll hear about Delaware, which is the most common, Wyoming, Florida, New Mexico, Nevada. Those are probably the most common ones that you hear. They're the most marketed. And there's different reasons for doing each one of them. Most of the time, we favor Delaware. Delaware is certainly the most common for tech companies and things like this. However, it isn't necessarily intrinsically better for you. When I first started forming companies, well, the first company that we ever formed for one of my businesses, we were doing some investment in the US, was a Nevada company. And then later on, when we got into this business, we kind of did some research and thought that Wyoming was good. One of the people I did business with was doing Florida, and gradually we moved to almost exclusively Delaware. So let's talk a little bit about why people choose one state over another. So you could look at filing costs. Honestly, it's not that big a deal. Like whether you're paying $200 or $400, $300 or $500 or whatever, doesn't make that big a difference. Which, by the way, what you'll see as the state fees, sometimes people will say, oh, it's $100 or something. It's, yeah, but that doesn't include registered office, registered address, registered agent, da-da-da-da-da. So by the time you pay all that stuff, it's a few $100 minimum. It's fine. Like really in the big picture of your business, that's not the important thing, right? The important thing is stability. The important thing is ease of doing business. The important thing is being able to get, being able to get bank accounts, etc. So let's just back up for a second and talk about US LLCs in general. Why do people like to form US LLCs? Well, because if you're a foreigner and you have a single member US LLC is what's considered a disregarded entity, which means it doesn't exist for US tax purposes. It doesn't file its own tax return. It does not change your tax status at all. The income of that entity is the same as the income of the member, or rather the member's income is the income of the entity, vice versa. Okay, so if a US LLC makes money, it's like having a sole proprietorship. That just gets included in the tax return of whoever the member is. The member is, so when you have an LLC has got members instead of shareholders. It's basically the same thing. There's subtle differences, but basically the same thing. You can think of it as the same. So that's for a single member LLC. And it's really, really common that what we would want to do is we would want to go and form this, because if I'm a non-resident alien, meaning I'm not American, I have nothing that makes me liable for US tax, then I don't have to pay US tax. And if I form an entity there, because it's a transparent entity, that doesn't create a tax liability for me. Now, if I'm conducting what's called US trade or business, if I have US source income, it's called effectively connected income or FDAP income, then I may have US tax liabilities, and you should look into that. You can contact us if you want some more details. But potentially, you could have no US tax liability. Now, this doesn't mean you have no other tax liability. You could be taxable in your country, etc. But it can make it easy to get bank accounts that are at big, reputable banks. These are easy companies to set up and maintain, relatively speaking, like very low filing requirements, quite simple. And on top of that, you can access US payment infrastructure, which might include things like Stripe, payment processing. You might notice one of the things that happens is if you're a foreign company that's processing payments in the of American clients, you'll have high decline rates. Your decline rates will fall a lot, which means your conversion rates will come up, which will mean you'll make more money. So there's a lot of good reasons why you may want to form a US entity. Sometimes for tax purposes, there can be some really interesting things there. For example, there's a mismatch between the rules in Canada and the US. They don't apply for, say, Australia and the US. You have to look at it on a country by country basis. But where US LLCs don't exist in most countries in the US corporate form. So how do they treat them in the other country? And they'll treat them typically either as partnerships or as corporations. Canada chooses to treat them as corporations. Australia treats them as partnerships. And so potentially, this is actually a really efficient tax vehicle for you. Maybe, okay? On top of that, like I said, you can access pretty good infrastructure. It's relatively low maintenance. It's relatively fast and easy to set up. The only thing is usually you'll have to visit in person. There are some ways that you can remote open bank accounts. If you want help with that, reach out to us. However, usually we say you're better off to go there. If you invest time, you can also build US credit and access US credit facilities and get points cards. This is also very good, right? So those are a few things. Now, where do we go from there? If you're going to do that, where do you set up? Well, usually what you're looking at is you're looking at privacy, you're looking at taxes, you're looking at laws. Okay, so in theory, the most private, a lot of people will say, is New Mexico because you can form with nothing. Now, it's alarming. If you were to compare, I'm forming a company today for somebody in Cyprus, and that Cyprus, they want a lot of due diligence. If you go to Gibraltar, they want a lot of due diligence. If you go to Labuan, they want a lot of due diligence, etc. You can form a company in the US with basically no due diligence, like literally nothing going on. So it's pretty crazy in terms of just how little you have to provide to set up that company, which makes the process very simple for you. However, like the amount of reporting as well, you'll have registries that are very opaque. Right? They're not transparent. There's not a lot of information. So there's pretty good privacy in that sense. You'll also get a bunch of asset protection rules that come in, and we'll do another video on asset protection you can check out. But you'll get something called charging order protection entities. You can get something called series LLCs, which is where you can segregate the limited liability within these different series within one company. And so it makes it harder to pierce, things like this. So there's a lot of pretty interesting rules that will help you to protect your assets. And so whether you're in Nevada, whether you're in Wyoming, whether you're in Delaware, you'll have varying degrees of that. You'll also look at the state income tax rules. Now, Delaware is not a zero state income tax jurisdiction. Okay, they have like somewhere around 8% state income tax. I can't remember what it is. However, that's only for income derived from Delaware. So if you're completely foreign to Delaware, you have no income derived from Delaware, then you could have no state income tax, therefore it's not relevant to you. There's also no state sales tax. Now, for a long time, this was a big deal. There was some recent ruling that was passed about, was it a year ago last spring? So a little over a year ago in South Dakota, that basically made it that sales tax basically would have to be paid potentially based on where the customer is rather than based on where the supplier is. And so this has changed things a little bit, and it's more similar to the EU VAT rules in that respect. However, it's kind of still being navigated. So that's something. Now, why do big companies all go there, right? Google, Facebook, Microsoft, you start running down the list, they're pretty much all in Delaware. There's a few reasons for this. One is they have really well-established case law, especially when it comes to intellectual property. This means that if it goes to court, the way that the ruling will take place is much more predictable than in places with less established case law. Okay, for example, Wyoming will not have that as well-established case law. Another thing is there's nuances in terms of the laws, say when you raise capital. For example, if you're talking about Silicon Valley investors, they're often looking for a company in California or a company in Delaware. Now, from the perspective of there's a California state franchise tax, you pay it regardless if you have operations in California, so you don't save anything by forming in Delaware. One of the differences, though, is that the laws have subtle ways in which they favor investors over favoring founders in Delaware and vice versa in California. So that's something to be aware of if you're raising money or doing whatever else. The last thing that's really relevant and worth noting, one of the main, well, actually two more things. One is the ease of their system. Their system is very efficient. So you can form companies a lot quicker than, say, my experience anyway, is that it's much faster and easier in Delaware than, say, Wyoming. So that's an advantage. They may have improved it since I last did it in Wyoming, but in general, that was the case. And on top of that, their court system, they have some special courts that make it quite efficient. So that's also useful in the case of if that's relevant to you, might or might not be. And the last thing has to do with banking. So US banking regulations that came in more or less state that the bank needs to have branches, or your company has to have nexus within areas where the bank has presence. So I remember when we formed this company in Nevada years ago, one of the things we were looking for was HSBC accounts. And HSBC had no presence in Nevada, so we were not able to open bank accounts at HSBC. So if you're setting up in Wyoming, Wyoming does not have very good banking presence. So your banking options are typically going to be more limited than in a place like Delaware. So that's an advantage to forming in Delaware. So anyway, these are all some of the reasons why, if you're a foreigner, or sometimes if you're domestic as well, and you're interested in setting up a company in the US, US LLC, Delaware is probably the default place that you would look to go. Now, it doesn't, especially if you're in the US, it doesn't mean you'll get to access their laws. Like, one of the things you'll hear is there's a lot of marketing about Nevada LLCs and the ability to have asset protection rules in Nevada, which are quite strong. But the problem is, if you have no connection to that state, when it goes to court, you may not have rule of law or choice of law determined by where the company is anyway, so you may not benefit from that. So if you lived in Nevada and your business was in Nevada, forming a Nevada company would give you those advantages. There's court cases where somebody, say, lived in Washington and they form an Alaska company or an Alaska trust hoping to benefit from that, and then they end up doing business with somebody in, I don't know, let's say, I forget where it was in the particular case, but let's say that it was Massachusetts, and you go to court and they say, well, hang on, this has nothing to do with Alaska, so we're going to disregard the Alaska trust rules and we're going to choose between Massachusetts or Washington, and then you might as well have formed in Washington. So anyway, those are all little things to know, and this is part of the reason why I say there's no one size fits all. It is case by case. It's one of the reasons why we don't just randomly sell companies to you on the website. But if you want help, if you want us to help you figure out what's best for you, it's a fairly quick, fairly simple process to do that, and then we can help you if you want set that company up. So hope that helps, and we will look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.